My daughter-in-law looked around my living room with the kind of calm entitlement that comes only from someone who has already decided they own what is not theirs. She smiled softly, the kind of smile people wear when they have rehearsed their lines, and said, "Your house is lovely. My parents will take the upstairs. My sister and her kids will take the downstairs. It's your duty to take them in." My son stood beside her, silent, eyes lowered, as if he were a guest in my home and not the child I had raised under this very roof. For a moment, the world felt very still. I heard the clock ticking behind me, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own heartbeat. They thought they had cornered me, an aging widower with nowhere to go, no one to fight for me, no one to defend these walls filled with the memories of the woman I once loved. They believed I would bow my head, say yes, and simply disappear into the background of my own life. Instead, I stood up slowly, letting the chair legs scrape against the hardwood floor, watching both of them flinch. I smiled, a calm, measured smile, the kind that made my daughter-in-law's confidence flicker for the first time. I said one sentence, only one, and the entire room fell silent. They did not know that the moment they tried to claim my home, they triggered something in me, something sharper than grief and older than fear. If the audience stays with me, they will see the betrayal, the humiliation, the secrets they never expected, and the revenge that will land harder than anything my daughter-in-law could imagine. This story does not end the way they think. My name is Henry Dawson. I am 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years building bridges and highways across 3 states. I built things meant to last, concrete and steel that would stand long after I was gone. I never imagined the hardest thing I'd ever have to build would be a case against my own daughter-in-law. The Sunday it all began was unseasonably warm for late October. I had just returned from visiting Linda's grave, where I'd spent an hour pulling weeds from around her headstone and telling her about the changing leaves she always loved. 8 months since the funeral, and I still talked to her every week as if she might answer. The drive home usually brought me peace, that quiet transition from grief back to the rhythm of daily life. But when I turned onto our street that afternoon, peace was the last thing waiting for me. 3 cars sat in my driveway. I recognized Andrew's sedan, but the others were unfamiliar, a silver SUV and a black luxury vehicle that screamed money spent to impress. My pulse quickened as I pulled in behind them. Through the living room window, I could see figures moving, shadows passing back and forth like they owned the place. I found them in the kitchen, not just Andrew and Samantha, but her entire family. Mark Whitmore with his golf tan and country club swagger, Carol with her appraising eyes cataloging every surface, and Julia, Samantha's younger sister, already opening cabinets as if taking inventory. They were walking through my home, touching Linda's things, discussing the layout like prospective buyers at an open house. "Henry." Samantha spotted me first. Her smile was wide and warm, the kind that never reached her eyes. "We didn't expect you back so soon. Come, sit down, we have wonderful news." I didn't sit. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, watching strangers claim territory that wasn't theirs to claim. "Your house is lovely, Henry," she continued, gesturing broadly at the space Linda had decorated with 35 years of love. "My parents have been looking at places nearby, but why bother when there's so much room here? Mom and Dad will take the upstairs bedroom, the one with the nice bathroom. Julia can have the guest room. You won't even notice they're here." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war wrapped in silk. I looked at my son. Andrew stood behind his wife, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the tile floor. He wouldn't look at me, couldn't look at me. In that moment, I saw the boy who'd once followed me to job sites, asking endless questions about load-bearing walls and foundation depths. That curious boy had become a man who couldn't meet his father's gaze while his wife dismantled everything we'd built. Carol Whitmore stepped forward, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "We're just thinking of you, Henry. A man your age, alone in this big house, it's not safe. We're family. Family takes care of each other." I watched Samantha exchange a glance with her mother, quick and knowing. There was something rehearsed in their movements, their words, the way they'd positioned themselves around the room. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. This was an occupation, planned and coordinated while I was talking to my dead wife about autumn leaves. And then I remembered. 3 months before Linda died, when the cancer had already begun stealing her strength, she'd gripped my hand with surprising force. "Henry, listen to me. If anything happens to me, find the blue envelope in my jewelry box. Promise me you won't open it unless you truly need it." I'd promised, confused and heartbroken, attributing her urgency to the medication or the fear of leaving me alone. I'd forgotten about that envelope until this very moment, standing in my kitchen, surrounded by vultures wearing family smiles. I looked at each of them in turn: Mark's arrogance, Carol's calculation, Julia's entitlement, Samantha's barely concealed triumph, and Andrew, my son, still staring at the floor. Then I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an engineer who just identified a structural flaw that everyone else had missed. What I said next made Samantha's smile freeze. But what I didn't say, what I was already planning, would eventually destroy everything she'd built. They moved in 48 hours later, as if my silence had been an invitation. I had said nothing that Sunday afternoon except a single sentence: "This is my home, and I decide who lives in it." But Samantha had only laughed, patting my arm like I was a confused child who didn't understand how the world worked. By Tuesday morning, suitcases lined the hallway, and the Whitmore family had claimed every spare inch of space Linda and I had built together. Carol started with the kitchen. I came downstairs to find her emptying cabinets, sorting Linda's carefully organized dishes into piles she deemed worthy or worthless. "These old things need to go," she announced, holding up the ceramic mixing bowl Linda's mother had given us as a wedding gift. "You can't possibly still use something this dated." Before I could respond, the bowl was in a garbage bag with a dozen other irreplaceable memories. I watched her discard 40 years of accumulated love like it was clutter at a yard sale, and I said nothing. But I remembered. My engineer's mind, trained to document every detail of a project, began cataloging each offense with cold precision. Julia was worse in her own way. She had inherited her mother's sense of entitlement without any of the pretense of politeness. "At his age, most people are grateful someone still visits," she said to Samantha one morning, not bothering to lower her voice, even though I sat in the next room. "He should be thanking us for taking care of him instead of looking at us like we're intruders." They laughed together, and the sound echoed through the house Linda had filled with warmth for 35 years. Mark Whitmore treated me like a tenant who hadn't paid rent. He commandeered my recliner, changed the television to his preferred channels, and left his golf magazines scattered across the coffee table where Linda's books used to rest. When I asked him to move his feet off the ottoman Linda had reupholstered herself, he looked at me with something between pity and contempt. "Relax, Henry. We're family now. What's yours is ours." I began to understand the shape of their plan on the third day. I had gone upstairs to retrieve a sweater and paused outside the guest room when I heard Samantha's voice through the partially open door. She was on the phone, speaking in the hushed but urgent tone of someone conducting business they didn't want overheard. "How soon can we list a property if the owner is no longer capable of managing it?" A pause. "Yes, I understand there's a process. But what if we had documentation, medical evaluations, that sort of thing?" Another pause. "Perfect. I'll be in touch soon." My blood ran cold. This wasn't about family togetherness or taking care of a lonely widower. This was about acquisition, pure and simple. They were planning to take my home, the home I'd built with Linda, the home we'd raised our son in, the home where every room held memories they were already throwing in garbage bags. I heard footsteps in the hallway and pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. Carol's voice drifted from the master bedroom where she'd been organizing Linda's closet without permission. "This is exactly what we did with Grandma's house, remember?" she said to someone, probably Julia. "The key is patience. Let them get comfortable. Let them depend on you. And then—" The door closed, cutting off the rest of her words. But I'd heard enough. The doorbell rang that afternoon, a small mercy in the form of Grace Miller from next door. She stood on the porch holding a pie, her silver hair pinned neatly back, her eyes sharp despite her 73 years. Grace had lived beside us for 15 years and had been close to Linda in ways I never fully understood. They'd spent countless afternoons together, drinking tea and talking about things wives discuss when husbands aren't around. "I brought you something," Grace said, handing me the pie. "Apple cinnamon. Your wife's recipe." Carol appeared behind me almost immediately, her radar for visitors apparently well tuned. "How lovely. You must be one of the neighbors." "I'm Carol Whitmore, Samantha's mother. We're staying here now to help Henry through this difficult time." Grace's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read passing across her face. She looked past Carol directly at me. "Your wife taught me this recipe when we were girls," she said quietly. "I thought you might like something familiar." The phrasing struck me as odd. When we were girls, Grace and Linda had met as adults, hadn't they? I wanted to ask what she meant, but Carol was already ushering Grace toward the door with aggressive hospitality, thanking her for the pie while making clear that further visits weren't necessary. "I'll come again soon," Grace said firmly, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that felt like a message. "There are things we should discuss, Henry. Things Linda wanted you to know." That night, after the Whitmores had retreated to their claimed territories and the house fell silent, I retrieved Linda's jewelry box from the closet. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, pushing aside her pearls and our wedding rings until my fingers found the blue envelope hidden beneath the velvet lining. It was heavier than I expected, thick with papers I couldn't see through the opaque material. 8 months of grief hadn't prepared me for this moment. I'd spent those months learning to sleep alone, to cook for one, to exist in a world that no longer contained Linda's laugh or her touch or her quiet wisdom. I thought I'd known everything about our marriage, every secret, every shared dream, but this envelope told me otherwise. I opened it expecting memories. Instead, I found a battle plan and proof that my wife had seen this war coming years before it arrived. The first thing I pulled from the envelope was a handwritten letter, Linda's elegant script filling 3 pages of ivory stationery. The date at the top made me catch my breath. She had written it 14 months before her death, long before the cancer diagnosis, long before either of us knew she was running out of time. This wasn't a dying woman's desperate warning. This was careful preparation from someone who saw trouble coming and refused to leave me undefended. "My darling Henry," the letter began, and I could hear her voice in every word, calm and steady as it had always been. "If you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take what we built. I prayed you would never need to open this envelope. But if you have, then the moment I feared has arrived, and you must act quickly. I've watched Samantha for years. I've seen how she looks at our home when she thinks no one is paying attention, not with love, but with calculation. I've seen how she isolates Andrew from us, how she positions herself between our son and his family. I've seen how she treats you when she thinks I'm not watching, the small cruelties she disguises as jokes, the dismissiveness she wraps in false concern." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. All those years, all those family dinners and holiday gatherings, Linda had been watching and worrying while I remained oblivious. She had carried this burden alone, protecting me from truths that would have caused conflict, shielding Andrew from accusations that might have destroyed his marriage. She had stayed silent out of love, but she had also prepared for war. "I stayed silent to protect our son's marriage," her letter continued. "I told myself that perhaps I was wrong, that perhaps Samantha would grow into the wife Andrew deserved. But I won't let my silence become your prison. If you're reading this, then my worst fears have been confirmed, and you need to know that you are not helpless." The letter instructed me to contact Paul Hargrove immediately. The name was familiar. He had been a colleague of Linda's at her law firm before she retired, an estate attorney she'd always spoken of with respect. "I modified our family trust 18 months ago," she wrote. "I added protective clauses that Paul will explain in detail. He has copies of everything, and he knows what to do. Trust him completely." But that wasn't all. Linda had gathered evidence, built a case file like the attorney she'd once been. "There is a camera in the antique kitchen clock," she explained. "I installed it 3 years ago when I first began to suspect Samantha's intentions. The footage uploads to a cloud account that Paul can access. There is also a file in our safety deposit box at First National, photographs, documents, things I collected that prove Samantha is not who she pretends to be." My hands were shaking now. I set the letter down and pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to steady myself. The woman I'd loved for 35 years, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, had been conducting a secret investigation under the same roof where we'd shared meals and celebrated anniversaries and grown old together. I felt grief that she'd carried this alone, gratitude that she'd thought to protect me, and guilt that I'd never noticed her preparations. How many nights had she lain awake beside me, planning for a future she wouldn't live to see, preparing defenses for a husband who didn't even know there was a threat? I picked up the letter again, my eyes finding one paragraph I'd already read 3 times. "They will try to declare you incompetent. They will try to take your home. They will try to erase everything we built together." I could almost hear Carol's voice from that morning, discussing what they'd done to someone's grandmother. Linda had predicted their tactics with chilling accuracy. "Don't let them, my love. I've given you the tools. Now use them." Beneath the letter were other documents, legal papers I would need Paul to explain, account statements, a list of names and phone numbers, and at the very bottom, an old photograph that made me stop breathing. Two young women smiled at the camera, arms linked, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. One was unmistakably Linda in her 20s, her hair darker than I'd ever known it, her smile bright with youth. The other woman looked remarkably like Grace Miller, the same sharp eyes, the same determined set to her jaw, though decades younger than the neighbor I knew. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink that had once been blue, someone had written, "Sisters, 1978. I stared at those two words until they stopped making sense. Sisters. Linda had never mentioned having a sister. In 35 years of marriage, through countless conversations about family and childhood in the past, she had never once spoken of a sibling. Grace Miller had lived next door for 15 years, and I had never suspected any connection deeper than friendship. But here was proof in Linda's own handwriting, hidden in the same envelope with her battle plans. I set the photograph aside, my mind too overwhelmed to process another revelation. The Whitmores were plotting to steal my home. My wife had spent years preparing my defense. And apparently, the neighbor who'd brought me pie that afternoon was not who she appeared to be. One crisis at a time. The sister mystery would have to wait. I read Linda's final instructions again. Call Paul first thing in the morning. Tell him the blue envelope is open. He'll know what it means. Linda had been fighting a war I never knew existed. And according to her letter, the deadliest weapon was waiting in Paul Hargrove's office. Paul Hargrove's office occupied the corner of a downtown building that had stood since before I was born. The brass nameplate on the door was polished but understated, the waiting room furnished with leather chairs that spoke of old money and careful discretion. I had called first thing that morning, as Linda's letter instructed, and the receptionist had put me through immediately. "Mr. Dawson," Paul had said, his voice carrying a weight of anticipation, "I've been waiting for this call. Can you come in today?" He met me at the door, personally a sharp-eyed man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of handshake that conveyed both competence and compassion. I remembered him from Linda's retirement party years ago, a quiet presence who'd spoken eloquently about her contributions to the firm. Now I understood why she'd trusted him with secrets she'd never shared with me. Linda updated her will and trust documents with me personally, Paul said once we were seated in his private office, the door closed against the world. She came to me 18 months before she passed, long before the diagnosis. She was worried, Henry. She didn't want to alarm you, but she also didn't want to leave you vulnerable. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a thick manila folder, its label typed in neat capitals, Dawson Protection File. The folder was at least 2 inches thick, stuffed with documents and photographs, and what appeared to be professional reports. He slid it across the desk toward me. "Everything Linda gathered is in here," he continued. "She wanted you to understand the full scope of what you're facing and the full scope of your defenses." I opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a professional investigator's report, complete with a licensed letterhead and a case number. My eyes caught the date 6 months before Linda died, when she was still healthy, still strong, still keeping this terrible secret. She had hired someone to follow Samantha, to document her movements, to uncover truths that would shatter our family if they ever came to light. The report was devastating. Over a 3-month surveillance period, the investigator had documented Samantha meeting with a divorce attorney on 4 separate occasions. She had also met twice with a real estate appraiser, once at our home while Linda and I were supposedly out of town. But the most damaging evidence came in a series of photographs that made my stomach turn. Samantha entering a hotel with a man who was decidedly not my son, timestamps showing she'd stayed for hours, the same hotel appearing 3 different times across 3 different weeks. She was planning to divorce Andrew, Paul said quietly, watching my face as I absorbed the implications. The investigator's conclusion was clear. Samantha was positioning herself to claim a portion of the family assets through divorce while simultaneously conducting an affair. She wanted the money without the marriage. I closed the folder, unable to look at any more photographs of my daughter-in-law's betrayal. Does Andrew know? Linda never told him. She never told anyone except me. Paul leaned forward, his expression serious. She wanted to give Andrew the chance to see the truth himself. She didn't want to destroy her son's marriage unless it became absolutely necessary. but she prepared everything in case that moment arrived. He went on to explain the legal architecture Linda had constructed. The family trust now contained what he called a duress protection clause, a provision that would activate if I could prove I was being coerced or exploited by family members. Once activated, the clause would transfer all assets to a protective entity that Samantha could never touch, regardless of her relationship to Andrew. The clause requires documented evidence, Paul explained. Threats, financial manipulation, elder abuse, any of these would qualify. Linda built this like a fortress, Henry. She anticipated exactly what Samantha might try. Your job now is to gather the evidence that activates these protections. There was more. Paul produced a single check from a separate envelope, the paper yellowed slightly with age. It was made out for $15,000, drawn on Linda's personal account, dated 3 years ago. The signature on the front was Linda's, or rather, a careful forgery of Linda's signature. On the back, someone had endorsed it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Linda discovered this about 6 months after it was cashed, Paul said. She could have reported it immediately. Forgery is a serious crime, and this would have been enough to have Samantha arrested. But she didn't report it. She kept the canceled check as evidence instead. Why? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because she loved Andrew. Because she hoped Samantha might change, might become the wife her son deserved. Because she didn't want to be the one who destroyed that marriage. Paul's voice softened. She was protecting everyone, Henry. You, Andrew. Even Samantha, in a way. She gave her every chance to become a better person. But she also made sure that if Samantha chose the other path, there would be consequences. I sat in silence, the weight of Linda's preparations pressing down on me. She had spent years building a case, gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, hiring investigators, all while smiling at family dinners and keeping peace for our son's sake. The sacrifice of it overwhelmed me. The love behind it broke my heart. What do I do now? I finally asked. Paul closed the folder and pushed it toward me. You go home, you watch, you document everything they do and say. Linda mentioned a camera. She told me it would capture what you need. And when you have enough evidence, you bring it to me, and we activate the clause that protects everything you and Linda built together. I left Paul's office with a folder full of ammunition and a dead wife's faith in my ability to use it. But the next discovery would come from the most unexpected source, a camera Linda hid in plain sight. The antique clock had hung on the kitchen wall for 20 years. Linda's grandmother had brought it from England, a beautiful piece with a brass face and hand-painted flowers that had faded to a soft patina over the decades. I had walked past it 10,000 times without giving it a second thought. Now I stood on a step stool, my heart pounding as I carefully lifted it from its hook and examined the back. The camera was smaller than I expected, a modern device, no larger than my thumb, professionally installed behind a false panel that blended seamlessly with the original woodwork. A tiny lens peered through what I had always assumed was a decorative flaw in the clock face. Linda had turned a family heirloom into a surveillance system, and no one had ever suspected. I carried my laptop to the bedroom, locked the door against the Whitmores who had taken over the rest of my home, and entered the login credentials Linda had included in her letter. The cloud storage account contained nearly 3 years of footage, organized by date, each file representing hours of kitchen activity captured without anyone's knowledge. My wife had been watching, recording, building evidence for a battle she knew might come. The early footage showed nothing remarkable: Linda and me having breakfast, Andrew and Samantha visiting for Sunday dinners, the ordinary rhythms of family life. But as I moved forward through the timeline, the tone shifted. Samantha's mask began to slip in moments when she thought only Linda was watching. The first clip that made my stomach turn was dated 18 months ago. Samantha stood at the counter while Linda sat at the table, visibly weaker from the early stages of her illness. "You're just going to die and leave us nothing useful, aren't you?" Samantha's voice dripped with contempt. "All this house, all this property, and it's going to be tied up in trusts and complications. You could make this easy, you know. You could just sign things over now, while you're still competent." Linda said nothing, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of patient endurance. I found another clip from around the same period, this one featuring Carol Whitmore. She and Samantha sat at the kitchen table while Linda napped upstairs, their voices low but clearly audible. "Once she's gone, the old man will be easy," Carol said with casual cruelty. Men that age fall apart without their wives. He'll be confused, dependent. We'll move in to help. And within 6 months, we'll have power of attorney. Within a year, the house. Samantha nodded, making notes on her phone, treating the destruction of my life like a project plan. I documented timestamps, saved critical clips, and forced myself to keep watching even as bile rose in my throat. Each piece of footage was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall Linda had built to protect me. I owed it to her to see everything she had seen, to know what she had endured in silence. Then I found the footage from 8 months ago, just 3 weeks before Linda died. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the light above the stove. Linda sat alone at the table, her face gaunt from the cancer that was stealing her from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. For a long moment, she simply stared at nothing, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. Then she began to cry silent, shaking sobs that she muffled with her hand, even though she thought no one could hear. "I'm sorry, Henry," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry I can't tell you, but I have to protect you my way. You would confront them, and they would twist it, and Andrew would have to choose. I can't make our son choose between his father and his wife, so I have to do this alone. Please forgive me, my love. Please understand." I closed the laptop and wept. For 10 minutes, I sat on the edge of the bed where Linda had taken her last breath and cried harder than I had at her funeral. She had suffered alone to spare me pain. She had watched our daughter-in-law plot against us, listened to threats and cruelty, and never said a word because she wanted to protect our family. The courage it must have taken, the loneliness she must have felt. When the tears finally stopped, something had changed inside me. The grief remained, but it had transformed into something harder, colder, more focused. Linda had given me weapons. Now I would use them. I called Paul that evening and described what I had found. He walked me through the process of securely transmitting the most damaging clips to his encrypted server, his voice growing grimmer with each file I sent. "This establishes a clear pattern of elder disrespect and financial exploitation," he said when the transfer was complete. "Combined with the investigator's report and the forged check, we're building an airtight case. Keep the camera running. Let them keep talking. They're building our case for us." I followed his advice. The Whitmores had no idea they were being watched, no idea that every cruel comment and whispered scheme was being captured and cataloged. I moved through the house like a ghost, compliant and quiet, letting them believe they had already won. The camera had captured 3 years of cruelty, but the footage I found the next morning revealed something far worse, a crime that could send Samantha to prison. The footage was dated just 4 days earlier, captured while I was at a routine doctor's appointment. I had told the Whitmores I would be gone for 2 hours, enough time for the examination and the drive across town. I never imagined what Samantha would do with those 2 hours. The kitchen camera had a partial view of the hallway leading to my home office, and I watched Samantha glance around the empty house before disappearing down that corridor. She emerged 20 minutes later, carrying her phone, her expression satisfied in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see what happened inside the office, but I could hear her phone call clearly as she passed through the kitchen. "I have what we need," she said to whoever was on the other end. "His signature is simple enough to copy just a few loops and a sharp downstroke. We can have the letter of intent ready by next week. Once he's declared incompetent, no one will question it." She laughed at something the other person said. "Don't worry. By the time anyone realizes what happened, it'll be too late to contest." My hands were shaking as I closed the laptop. Signature, letter of intent, declared incompetent. She wasn't just planning to push me aside, she was planning to forge legal documents that would strip me of everything Linda and I had built together. I went to my office immediately, closing the door behind me and locking it for the first time since the Whitmores had invaded. My filing cabinet stood against the wall, its contents supposedly private, supposedly secure. I pulled open the drawer where I kept important documents, the deed to the house, insurance policies, tax records, and began searching for anything that didn't belong. I found it near the back, filed between old utility contracts as if it had always been there. A single page, professionally formatted, bearing the heading Letter of Intent regarding property transfer. The document stated that I, Henry Robert Dawson, wished to transfer ownership of my family home to my son Andrew William Dawson and his wife Samantha Grace Whitmore Dawson upon determination of diminished mental capacity by a licensed physician. It was dated 3 weeks ago and bore my signature at the bottom, except I had never seen this document before. I had never signed it. And on the date printed at the top, I had been in the hospital for a minor cardiac procedure, sedated and monitored, physically incapable of signing anything. The forgery was excellent, I had to admit that much. Whoever had copied my signature had studied it carefully, capturing the loops and angles that made it distinctive. But it wasn't perfect. The pressure was wrong, too consistent, lacking the natural variation of a real signature. And the date was a fatal error, one that any investigation would immediately uncover. Then I noticed the second signature line at the bottom of the page. Under the heading Witness, someone had signed Andrew's name. My heart sank. Had my own son participated in this fraud? Had Samantha convinced him to help forge documents that would steal his father's home? I stared at Andrew's signature, looking for answers in the loops of ink, and slowly I began to see something wrong. The letters were shaky, uneven, as if written by a hand that wasn't entirely steady. The A leaned too far to the right. The final letter trailed off weakly, lacking the confident stroke that characterized my son's handwriting. I thought back to 3 weeks ago, searching my memory for anything unusual. Andrew had mentioned something in passing a rough night, he'd called it, when Samantha had insisted they stay for dinner and kept refilling his wine glass until he could barely walk to the car. I had assumed it was just an evening that got away from them. Now I understood. She had gotten him drunk deliberately, probably shoved a pen in his hand and guided it across the page, while he was too impaired to understand what he was signing. My son hadn't betrayed me. He'd been used, just like I was being used, just like Linda had been used. Samantha had turned Andrew into an unwitting accomplice to federal fraud. I photographed everything, the forged document, the signatures, the filing cabinet where it had been hidden. I photographed the hospital discharge papers that proved I couldn't have signed anything on that date. Then I sent it all to Paul Hargrove, my hands still trembling with a mixture of rage and vindication. His response came within the hour. This is elder fraud, Henry, combined with the forged check from 3 years ago. We're looking at a clear pattern of criminal behavior. This isn't just civil court anymore, this is federal felony territory. She could face prison time. He paused, and I could hear him thinking through the legal strategy. But I need one more piece. I need something directly from Samantha's mouth, a verbal threat or admission that we can present to the court. Written evidence can be contested, but if she says the words herself, on recording, there's no defense. Can you get that? I thought about the camera still running in the kitchen, capturing every conversation. I thought about Samantha's arrogance, her certainty that she had already won. She would slip eventually. People like her always did. I can get it, I said. Good. Push her buttons if you have to. Make her feel threatened. People who think they're in control tend to say things they shouldn't when that control is challenged. I agreed and ended the call, already planning my next move. The trap was being set, baited with patience and precision. I had evidence of her crimes. I had recordings of her cruelty. But the next revelation would come from the woman next door, and it would change everything I thought I knew about my own family. Grace Miller's invitation came the next morning, delivered in person while the Whitmores were distracted by a phone call about their delayed furniture shipment. She appeared at the back door, her eyes carrying the same intensity I'd noticed the day she brought the pie. "Come to my house for tea this afternoon," she said quietly. "There are things we need to discuss. Things Linda wanted you to know." She pressed a key into my hand. "Use the back gate. They don't need to see where you're going." I slipped away at 3 o'clock, crossing through the garden gate that connected our properties, a gate Linda had insisted we install years ago, though I'd never understood why she wanted such easy access to the neighbor's yard. Now that small detail, like so many others, took on new meaning. Grace's living room stopped me in my tracks. Photographs covered nearly every surface on the mantel, the end tables, the walls, and in picture after picture, I saw Linda as a teenager with long dark hair, Linda in her 20s wearing a graduation gown, Linda on her wedding day, radiant in white lace. I moved from frame to frame, my confusion growing with each image. Why would our neighbor have so many pictures of my wife? "It's time you knew the truth, Henry." Grace stood in the doorway to the kitchen, a tea tray in her hands, watching me study the photographs. She set the tray down and gestured for me to sit, then lowered herself into the chair across from me with the careful movements of someone carrying a heavy burden. Linda wasn't just my friend, she said softly. She was my younger sister. We were born Grace and Linda Patterson before we married and took different names. The words didn't make sense at first. I heard them, understood their meaning individually, but couldn't reconcile them with 35 years of marriage to a woman I thought I knew completely. That's impossible, I heard myself say. Linda never mentioned having a sister. Not once. Grace nodded, pain flickering across her face. We had a complicated family, Henry. Our parents were difficult people, and when I was 19, I married a man who promised to take me away from all of it. That marriage was a disaster. He was cruel, controlling. When I finally escaped, I changed my name and cut ties with everyone from my old life, including Linda. I was ashamed. I didn't want anyone from my past to find me. She paused, her eyes distant with memories. Linda found me anyway. 15 years ago, she tracked me down through a private investigator. She showed up on my doorstep and said, "I've been looking for you for 20 years. Please don't disappear again." She convinced me to buy the house next door. She wanted us to reconnect, but slowly. She was afraid of overwhelming you with her past, afraid you might feel deceived if you learned she'd hidden something so significant. But why hide it at all, I asked, still struggling to absorb the revelation. Because she was ashamed too, Grace said gently. Ashamed that our family was so broken, that she'd lost her only sister for so long. She kept meaning to tell you, kept waiting for the right moment, and then she got sick, and suddenly there was no time left for old secrets. All that mattered was protecting you from what was coming. Grace reached beneath the coffee table and produced a thick binder, its pages filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and printed documents. When Linda knew she was dying, she made me promise to watch over you. She told me everything about Samantha, about the investigator, about the trust. She said, "If Henry ever needs help, tell him I'm still fighting for him." She opened the binder and began turning pages. "I've been documenting Samantha's behavior since the funeral. I've photographed real estate agents visiting the house when they thought no one was watching. I've recorded conversations through my kitchen window. This state allows single-party consent, so it's all legal. I've kept a journal of dates and incidents, everything I've witnessed. The evidence was meticulous photographs with timestamps showing unfamiliar cars in my driveway, transcripts of conversations where Samantha discussed getting the old man out of the way, notes documenting every cruelty Grace had observed from her vantage point next door. My sister asked me to be her eyes when she couldn't be here anymore," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I've been keeping her promise, Henry. Every single day since she left us, I've been watching, waiting, gathering what you might need." I looked at this woman, Linda's sister, my sister-in-law, a stranger who was also family, and felt something crack open in my chest. Linda had built a network of protection around me, layer after layer, preparing for a battle she knew she wouldn't live to fight. She had recruited her own sister, installed cameras, hired investigators, modified trusts, all while smiling at family dinners and never letting me see her fear. "She loved you more than I've ever seen anyone love anything," Grace said quietly. "She used to tell me, 'Henry is my whole heart. I would burn down the world to keep him safe.' She prepared for this fight for years, Henry. She loved you that much." I reached across the space between us and took Grace's hand, my wife's sister's hand, rough with age but warm with shared purpose. "Thank you," I said, "for keeping her promise, for being here. We'll finish what she started," Grace replied firmly. Together, I had Linda's sister in my corner and evidence from every direction. But when I planted a seed of doubt in Andrew's mind, I didn't expect it to grow so quickly or bear such bitter fruit. The seed I planted was small but deliberate. I left the forged check, the one Linda had discovered 3 years ago, on my desk in the home office, partially visible beneath a stack of utility bills. It was positioned exactly where someone rifling through papers would notice it, where the signature and the amount would catch their eye before they could look away. I knew Samantha wouldn't be the one to find it. She avoided the office now, perhaps sensing that her earlier trespass had been somehow detected. But Andrew still came in occasionally to use the printer, still maintained some connection to the space where he'd done homework as a teenager. He found it on a Thursday afternoon. I heard his footsteps pause in the hallway, heard the rustle of papers being moved, then silence. When he emerged from the office 10 minutes later, His face was pale and his jaw was tight. He walked directly to the kitchen where Samantha was instructing her mother on the proper arrangement of my pantry. I positioned myself in the living room, close enough to hear, but not close enough to seem obvious. "What is this?" Andrew's voice was controlled, but strained. I heard the check being placed on the counter, a pause. Then Samantha's voice, smooth as silk. "Oh, that. Your mother gave me that money as a gift. Years ago, when we were struggling with the down payment on our first apartment, she wanted to help with our finances but didn't want to embarrass you by making it seem like charity. Mom never mentioned it. Of course she didn't, sweetheart. That was the whole point. She wanted to spare your pride." Samantha's tone shifted to gentle condescension. "You know how she was, always taking care of everyone behind the scenes." The conversation ended there, Samantha redirecting attention to dinner plans and Carol's opinion on spice racks. But I had seen Andrew's face as he walked past the living room doorway, and what I saw gave me hope. He had accepted the explanation on the surface. But beneath that acceptance, something was working, some small engine of doubt that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at me as he passed, but his steps had slowed, as if he was carrying a new weight he hadn't expected. That evening, long after the Whitmores had retreated to their claimed territories, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. Andrew stood in the hallway, still dressed in his work clothes, though he'd been home for hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands jammed into his pockets like a teenager called to the principal's office. "Dad, can we talk?" I opened the door wider and let him in. He didn't sit on the chair I offered, instead pacing the small space between the bed and the window, unable to keep still. Finally he stopped, his back to me, staring out at the darkened yard. "Did Mom ever mention giving Samantha money? Large amounts, I mean. $15,000 or more?" I chose my words carefully, knowing that what I said next could push him toward the truth or drive him further into denial. "Your mother kept detailed records of every dollar she spent, meticulous records. You know how she was. I've gone through all of her financial documents since she passed, and I've never seen any record of gifts to Samantha. Not 15,000, not any amount." Andrew's shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn around, didn't respond for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The signature on that check looks strange, not quite right." I noticed that too. He turned then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, the beginning of clarity, painful and unwelcome but impossible to ignore. "I need to think," he said, and left without another word. Over the following days, I watched my son transform. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. Andrew had spent too many years avoiding conflict for that. But the changes were unmistakable to a father who knew him. He began watching Samantha with new eyes, his gaze tracking her movements across the room, his expression flickering whenever her stories didn't quite add up. He noticed how she interrupted me, how she rolled her eyes when I spoke, how her voice hardened when she thought no one was listening. He started coming home from work earlier, finding excuses to be in whatever room I occupied. Sometimes he sat with me on the porch as evening fell, neither of us speaking, just sharing space the way we used to when he was a boy. The wall between us, the one Samantha had spent years constructing, was developing cracks. I could see him struggling, torn between the wife he'd committed his life to and the truth that was slowly becoming impossible to deny. One afternoon, while searching through Linda's belongings for documents Grace had mentioned, I found an old brochure tucked between pages of a photo album. It advertised lakeside cabins in Vermont, the same area where Linda and I had always talked about retiring. "Wouldn't it be wonderful?" she used to say. "A little place by the water where we could watch the sunset every evening." We'd never made it there. Life kept getting in the way: work, family obligations, the thousand small delays that pushed dreams into the future until suddenly there's no future left. On the margin of the brochure, in Linda's handwriting, were 2 words: "Our dream someday." I set the brochure aside, my chest tight with regret for the life we'd never gotten to live. Another casualty of time's relentless march. Another plan that would remain forever unfulfilled. I couldn't know then what that brochure truly meant, what Linda had done in secret to make our someday real. That revelation would come later, after the battle was won. For now, there were more immediate concerns. Andrew was waking up, slowly but surely, and Samantha could sense it. I saw her watching him with narrowed eyes, saw her increasing efforts to keep him close, to isolate him from me. She knew something had shifted, even if she didn't understand what. Andrew was starting to see cracks in the woman he married. But Samantha had one more move to make one so cruel, so calculated, that it would force everyone to choose sides once and for all. The footage that changed everything was captured on a Tuesday morning while I pretended to nap in the living room. Samantha had grown careless, assuming that an old man dozing in a recliner couldn't possibly be a threat. She stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the hushed but urgent tone of someone conducting business they didn't want overheard. The camera caught every word. "Dr. Warren, thank you for taking my call. I need documentation that my father-in-law is showing signs of cognitive decline." She paused, listening. Yes, confusion, memory problems, inability to manage his own finances. He's been getting worse since my mother-in-law passed. We're concerned he might hurt himself or make decisions that aren't in his best interest. Another pause. "I understand what I'm asking. My mother will compensate you appropriately for your time and expertise. We just need an official evaluation on record." I sat frozen in the recliner, my eyes closed, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was scheduling a fraudulent medical evaluation, laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent. Once that documentation existed, she could petition the court for guardianship, take control of my finances, sell my home, and deposit me in whatever facility she deemed appropriate. Everything Linda had warned about was coming true. "Next Thursday works perfectly," Samantha continued. "I'll make sure he's here. He won't even know what the visit is really about until it's too late." She laughed at something the doctor said, a cold sound that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry. By this time next month, we'll have everything sorted out." I waited until she left the kitchen before opening my eyes. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I needed to call Paul immediately, but Paul called me first. "Henry, something remarkable just happened," he said, his voice carrying an edge of amazement I'd never heard before. "Do you know a Dr. Warren, a physician here in town?" "Samantha just scheduled an appointment with him," I said. "I heard the whole thing on the camera. She's trying to get him to document that I'm cognitively impaired." "I know. He called me 20 minutes ago." I nearly dropped the phone. "He what?" "Dr. Warren was Linda's personal physician for 15 years, Henry. He recognized Samantha's name immediately when she called." Paul paused, letting the implications sink in. 3 years ago, Linda visited him privately. She told him that her daughter-in-law might someday attempt to have you declared incompetent through fraudulent means. She asked him to contact me if anyone ever requested false documentation about your mental state. She was quite specific about the details. I sank back into the recliner, overwhelmed. Linda's protection extended even to doctors Samantha had tried to corrupt. My wife had anticipated this exact scenario, had prepared for it years in advance, had built safeguards I was only now discovering. "What did Dr. Warren tell Samantha?" I asked. "He played along, agreed to the appointment, took her money offer under advisement. But he has no intention of providing fraudulent documentation. In fact, he's already agreed to testify about her attempt to bribe him if this ever goes to court." Paul's tone shifted to businesslike efficiency. "But we can't rely solely on his word. We need independent documentation of your competency before Samantha can file any petition. I've already scheduled you an appointment for tomorrow morning." Dr. Michelle Torres operated from a small but well-appointed office near the university hospital. She was younger than I expected, early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Linda. Her credentials, displayed on the wall, were impeccable. Board certification in geriatric psychiatry, fellowships at prestigious institutions, years of experience in exactly the kind of evaluation I was about to undergo. The assessment took 90 minutes. She tested my memory, short-term, long-term, working memory for complex tasks. She evaluated my reasoning abilities, my judgment, my capacity to understand and manage financial matters. She asked me to draw clocks, recall word lists, solve logic puzzles, explain complex concepts. She questioned me about my daily routines, my decision-making processes, my understanding of my own situation. By the end, I was exhausted but confident. I had answered every question clearly, completed every task without difficulty. Whatever Samantha claimed about my declining mind, the evidence said otherwise. Dr. Torres removed her glasses and set down her clipboard, regarding me with what might have been admiration. Mr. Dawson, you're sharper than most people half your age. Your memory function is excellent. Your reasoning abilities are intact, and your judgment is sound. There is absolutely no indication of cognitive impairment. She smiled slightly. If anything, you're operating at a higher level than many professionals I've evaluated. I'll provide a notarized report you can use in any legal proceeding. No court in the country would find you incompetent based on my assessment. Paul filed the evaluation that same afternoon, registering it as a protective record with the county court. This meant that if Samantha attempted to petition for guardianship based on claims of cognitive decline, my documented competency would already be on file. Her fraudulent scheme would collapse before it began. But Paul wasn't finished. He also reported Dr. Warren's initial willingness to participate in fraud to the state medical board, providing documentation of Samantha's bribery attempt. Even if the board didn't take immediate action, the report would exist in official records, another piece of evidence in the pattern of criminal behavior we were documenting. We've cut off her main avenue of attack, Paul said when he called that evening to confirm everything was in place. She can't declare you incompetent. She can't forge documents without detection, and she can't corrupt doctors who've already been warned. But we still need one more piece to activate the trust's protection clause. We need her to make a direct threat on the record, something verbal, something undeniable. Can you set that up? I thought about Samantha's arrogance, her certainty that she had already won. I thought about how people like her unraveled when their control was challenged, when their carefully constructed plans began to crumble. Push the right buttons, and she would say things she shouldn't. I knew exactly which buttons to push. I can do it, I said. She's planning some kind of family gathering this weekend. I'll make sure she feels cornered. Be careful, Henry. Desperate people do desperate things. I know, but I'm not the one who should be afraid anymore. Samantha thought she was hunting a confused old man. She had no idea she was walking into a trap 3 years in the making, and the trigger was about to be pulled. I called the family meeting for Saturday afternoon, framing it as a chance to discuss living arrangements and find common ground. The Whitmores accepted immediately, unable to hide their satisfaction. They believed I was finally ready to surrender, that weeks of pressure had worn down an old man's resistance until he had no choice but to capitulate. They gathered in the dining room with the eager energy of vultures circling a weakening prey. Mark arrived first, claiming the chair at the far end of the table as if establishing territory. Carol followed with a leather folder tucked under her arm, her expression carrying the smug certainty of someone holding winning cards. Julia settled beside her mother, already scrolling through her phone with practiced disinterest. Samantha positioned herself at Mark's right hand, a general preparing to accept surrender. And Andrew, my son, lingered in the doorway, his face unreadable, his loyalties still uncertain. I took my seat at the head of the table, Linda's chair. For 35 years, she had sat here during family dinners, presiding over holidays and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday evenings. The Whitmores had tried to claim this spot since their arrival, but I had refused to yield it. Now I settled into its familiar embrace and felt Linda's presence wrap around me like armor. "Thank you all for coming," I began, keeping my voice mild, unthreatening. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult. I thought we should talk about how to move forward." Samantha smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "We're so glad you're ready to have this conversation, Henry. We've been worried about you." She nodded to her mother, who opened the leather folder and began spreading documents across the table. "These are just some papers to make things easier," Carol explained in the patronizing tone one might use with a slow child. "Power of attorney, so Samantha can help manage your finances. A property transfer agreement to ensure the house stays in the family. And authorization for care decisions in case you ever need medical attention and can't speak for yourself." I looked at the documents without touching them. Each one was a chain designed to bind me, a lock meant to cage me in my own home. Power of attorney would give Samantha control of my bank accounts. The property transfer would sign away the house Linda and I had built together. The care authorization would let them commit me to a facility whenever they deemed it convenient. "These are serious documents," I said carefully. "I'd need time to review them with my own attorney." Mark leaned forward, his golf-tan face creased with false concern. "Henry, we're family. You don't need outside lawyers complicating things. Just sign where Carol marked, and we'll take care of everything." There are some excellent nursing facilities nearby, Julia added without looking up from her phone. Mom and I toured one last week. Very clean. They have bingo nights. Carol placed a pen beside my hand. It's time to face reality, Henry. You're not young anymore. You shouldn't be rattling around this big house alone. We're offering to help, to take the burden off your shoulders. Don't be stubborn about this. I pushed the pen away gently. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to sign anything today. The temperature in the room dropped. Samantha's smile vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. She leaned forward, her manicured nails pressing into the table's surface. You don't understand your situation, Henry. Her voice dripped with false concern wrapped around a thread as sharp as broken glass. We're trying to help you. We've reorganized our entire lives to be here for you. But if you won't cooperate, we'll have to take measures. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. There are legal ways to handle people who can't make good decisions for themselves. Courts that can appoint guardians. Doctors who can evaluate competency. We don't want to go that route, but you're not leaving us much choice. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, let her words echo in the space between us. In my pocket, my phone recorded every syllable. Mark cleared his throat, uncomfortable with how explicit his daughter had become. Carol shuffled the documents back into her folder, her expression sour. Julia finally looked up from her phone, sensing that something had shifted. And Andrew stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes fixed on his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. We'll give you a few days to think it over, Samantha said, forcing her composure back into place. But don't take too long, Henry. Our patience has limits. The meeting dissolved into awkward retreat. The Whitmores filed into the living room, their confidence shaken but not broken. I watched Samantha pull Carol aside near the window, their heads bent together in urgent, whispered conference. They were regrouping, adjusting their strategy, planning their next assault. Whatever they decided, I knew it would come soon. Andrew remained in the doorway a moment longer, his gaze meeting mine. Something passed between us, not quite understanding, not yet trust, but the beginning of recognition. Then Samantha called his name sharply, and he turned away to join her. I had her threats on tape, but they weren't specific enough for court. I needed her to cross a line she couldn't walk back from. The next night, at her housewarming party, she would cross it in front of witnesses. The invitation cards appeared 3 days later, printed on expensive cream-colored stock with gold lettering. Please join us for a housewarming celebration at the Dawson residence. The audacity took my breath away. Samantha was throwing a party to celebrate her family's occupation of a home they didn't own, inviting neighbors and friends to witness their conquest, while the rightful owner stood among them like a ghost in his own life. I played my part perfectly. As guests arrived that Saturday evening, I shuffled through the rooms looking appropriately confused and diminished. I smiled vaguely when spoken to, repeated questions as if I hadn't heard them the first time. Let Samantha guide me by the elbow like an elderly patient requiring supervision. The performance cost me my dignity, but dignity could be reclaimed. The recording running continuously in my pocket was worth any temporary humiliation. The house filled with people I barely recognized, Samantha's colleagues, the Whitmore's country club friends, a smattering of neighbors who'd known Linda and me for years. Carol had transformed the living room with rented decorations and catered appetizers, erasing Linda's careful touches beneath a veneer of expensive impermanence. I watched strangers drink wine from crystal glasses Linda had inherited from her mother, and I smiled, and I waited. The moment I'd been hoping for came halfway through the evening. Margaret Hensley, who lived 3 houses down and had attended Linda's funeral, approached Samantha near the fireplace with a glass of champagne in hand. "Samantha, I didn't realize you owned this beautiful home," Margaret said with genuine admiration. "I always thought it belonged to Henry and Linda." Samantha's smile broadened, warm and confident. "Well, not officially yet, but we're in the process. My father-in-law is getting older, as you can see." She gestured toward where I stood, pretending to examine a bookshelf. "We're taking over to help him manage things. These transitions take time to sort out properly, but soon it will all be settled." Margaret nodded sympathetically, patting Samantha's arm. "How wonderful that you're here for him. So many elderly people don't have family willing to step up." I turned away, hiding my expression. Samantha had just made a false claim of ownership in front of a witness, not enough on its own, but another thread in the tapestry of evidence we were weaving. The night was young, and wine was flowing freely. I knew that patience would deliver something far more damaging. By 10 o'clock, the party had thinned to a core group of Whitmore allies and a few lingering neighbors. Samantha had been drinking steadily all evening, her careful composure softening around the edges, her voice growing louder with each refilled glass. I positioned myself in the kitchen, ostensibly tidying up, knowing she would find me eventually. Frustrated people seek out the source of their frustration. I simply had to wait. She appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, a half-empty wine glass in her hand, her eyes glittering with suppressed anger. The mask she wore in public was slipping, revealing the predator beneath the polished surface. She glanced behind her to ensure we were alone, then stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Listen carefully, old man." I looked at her with the same mild, confused expression I'd worn all evening. My hand rested casually in my pocket, touching the phone that was capturing every word. "You're going to sign those papers." She jabbed a finger toward my chest, stopping just short of contact. "I'm done playing nice. I'm done waiting for you to come to your senses. You have until the end of the month. And then we're doing this the hard way." "The hard way?" I asked, keeping my voice quavering, uncertain. "We'll have you declared incompetent. The doctors, the courts, it's all just paperwork when you know the right people." She stepped closer still, close enough that I could smell the wine on her breath. "We'll put you in the worst nursing home we can find, someplace where they park old men in wheelchairs and forget about them. And then we'll sell this house and everything in it. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every pathetic memento of your precious Linda." She paused, her lips curling into something that might have been a smile if there had been any warmth behind it. "This is your last warning, Henry. Sign willingly, or sign when you're too drugged to know what you're signing. Either way, we get what we want. The only question is how much you suffer first." I held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I nodded slowly, as if defeated, and turned back to the dishes in the sink. I heard her satisfied exhale, felt her presence retreat from the kitchen, heard her heels clicking toward the living room where her victory party continued. I excused myself to bed an hour later, pleading exhaustion. In my locked bedroom, I connected my phone to the laptop and transmitted the recording to Paul Hargrove's encrypted server. The audio was crystal clear, every threat, every ultimatum, every damning word preserved in digital amber. Paul's response arrived at midnight. "This is it, Henry." She made a direct threat of elder coercion with specific, combined with the camera footage, the forged documents, and the bribery attempt. "We can now activate the trust's protection clause. I'm filing the motion first thing Monday morning. This ends now." I read the message 3 times, allowing myself a small smile. Linda's trap had just snapped shut. Samantha thought she'd delivered an ultimatum. She didn't realize she'd just signed her own eviction notice. But the biggest surprise was still coming, and it would come from the person she least expected. The knock came at 6 in the morning, 2 days after the party. I had been lying awake for hours, running through the evidence in my mind, planning the next moves in a game that was finally approaching its endgame. When I opened my bedroom door, Andrew stood in the hallway looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his shirt wrinkled as if he'd pulled it from the floor. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something else: determination, perhaps, or the sharp clarity that comes when comfortable lies finally shatter. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Alone. Now." I dressed quickly and followed him to his car. We drove in silence through the gray morning light, past familiar streets, and into the next town where no one would recognize us. He pulled into the parking lot of a roadside diner, the kind of place that served strong coffee to truck drivers and asked no questions. We took a booth in the back corner, far from the handful of early morning customers. Andrew ordered coffee with hands that trembled slightly. When the waitress left, he reached into his jacket and placed a manila folder on the table between us. It was thick with papers, photographs, the accumulated weight of secrets finally dragged into daylight. "I've been watching her," he said quietly. "For the past 3 weeks, ever since I found that check, I've been documenting everything." He opened the folder and began spreading its contents across the laminated surface. Photographs. First Samantha entering a hotel with a man I didn't recognize, the same man appearing in multiple shots across different dates and locations. credit card statements highlighted in yellow, showing purchases she'd never mentioned and trips to places she'd claimed to visit alone. Printouts of text messages between Samantha and her mother, their casual cruelty preserved in black and white. "Look at this one," Andrew said, pointing to a text exchange dated 3 weeks ago. Carol had written, "How is the transition progressing?" Samantha's response, "Slowly. The old man is more stubborn than we expected. But once the competency petition goes through, it won't matter what he wants. We'll have control of everything." Carol's reply included a smiling emoji and 3 words, "Just like Grandma." I stared at the messages, watching the conspiracy unfold in their own careless words. They had never imagined anyone would read these exchanges, never dreamed that Andrew would stop trusting his wife long enough to look for evidence of her betrayal. But the worst was yet to come. Andrew's hands shook more violently as he reached for the final item in the folder, a photograph of a positive pregnancy test, still in its plastic casing, photographed against the marble of their bathroom counter. The date stamp showed it was taken 3 days ago, but the test itself was dated 3 months earlier. "I found this hidden in her drawer," Andrew said, his voice cracking, behind her jewelry box, wrapped in a scarf like she was hiding treasure. He looked up at me, and I saw the devastating truth written in his eyes before he spoke the words. "The baby isn't mine, Dad. We haven't. It's been months since we were together like that." I did the timeline over and over. "It's impossible." The confession broke something in him. Tears spilled down his cheeks, and his shoulders heaved with sobs he'd been holding back for days, maybe years. I watched my son crumble in a diner booth, destroyed by the woman he'd trusted with his life, and I felt my own heart break alongside his. "She's been playing me our entire marriage," he choked out, "using me to get to this family, to the house, the money, everything Mom built." He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to stem the flow. "Mom tried to warn me years ago. She never said anything explicit, but she tried to show me the way Samantha treated her, the little cruelties she thought nobody noticed. And I didn't listen. I defended Samantha. I chose her over my own mother." He looked at me with an anguish that transcended words. "I'm so sorry, Dad, for everything, for being blind, for being weak, for leaving you alone when you needed me most." I reached across the table and gripped his hand, my son's hand, rough with work and trembling with grief, but reaching back toward me for the first time in years. "Your mother never stopped loving you," I said quietly. "Not for a single moment. She knew Samantha was manipulating you. She saw what was happening, but she also knew that if she pushed too hard, she'd lose you entirely. So she protected you the only way she could by preparing for the day when you would finally see the truth yourself." Andrew's tears flowed freely now, but something in his expression was shifting. The grief remained, but alongside it grew something harder, stronger. "Resolution. She left evidence," I continued. "Hidden cameras, private investigators, modified trusts. She built a fortress around everything we have, and she trusted that someday you would help me defend it." He wiped his face with the back of his hand and straightened in his seat. The broken man who had sat down was rebuilding himself before my eyes, brick by brick, breath by breath. "Then let's finish what Mom started," he said. Together, for a long moment, we simply sat there, father and son, decades of distance collapsing in the space between heartbeats. The wall Samantha had built between us, carefully constructed over years of manipulation and isolation, had finally crumbled. Whatever came next, we would face it as a family. My son had come home. Together, we had enough evidence to end this war. But when the sheriff arrived at our door, even I wasn't prepared for how completely Samantha's world would collapse. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a well-engineered structure finally bearing its intended load. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when the doorbell rang, its chime cutting through the quiet house like a starting pistol. Through the front window, I saw 2 sheriff's deputies standing on the porch alongside Paul Hargrove, whose expression carried the grim satisfaction of a general about to deliver a decisive blow. Samantha reached the door before I could, her silk robe hastily tied, her hair still mussed from sleep. She pulled it open with the irritated confidence of someone expecting good news delivered at an inconvenient hour. Perhaps she assumed the authorities had come to support her competency complaint, to drag the confused old man away for evaluation. Her smile was already forming when Paul stepped forward and handed her a sheaf of official documents. Mrs. Whitmore Dawson, I'm serving you with an emergency protective order signed by County Judge Harrison this morning. Paul's voice was calm, professional, utterly without mercy. You and your family are ordered to vacate this property within 7 days. Additionally, you're subject to a restraining order requiring you to stay 500 feet from Mr. Henry Dawson pending a hearing on elder abuse charges. For a moment, Samantha simply stared at the papers in her hands as if they were written in a language she didn't understand. Then the words penetrated, and I watched her carefully constructed reality begin to shatter, like glass striking concrete. This is impossible, she breathed. There's been a mistake. The chaos erupted behind her before she could finish. Carol appeared in the hallway, took one look at the deputies, and began screaming that this was all a misunderstanding, that they needed to speak to someone in charge, that her family had connections who would sort this out immediately. Mark pushed past his wife, his face purple with rage, threatening to sue the sheriff's department, the judge, Paul Hargrove, and anyone else within reach of his fury. Julia burst into tears on the stairs, her phone already pressed to her ear as she called someone a lawyer, perhaps, or a friend who might somehow reverse the tide that was washing away their plans. The deputies remained calm throughout the storm. The older one, a gray-haired man with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen worse, explained that failure to comply with the order would result in immediate arrest. He suggested they begin packing and make arrangements for alternative accommodations. His partner handed Carol a copy of the protective order and stepped back to observe the proceedings with professional detachment. Andrew appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. He was fully dressed, his expression set in stone. Samantha turned to him, her eyes desperate. Andrew, tell them this is insane. Tell them your father has lost his mind. We need to fight this together. My son met her gaze without flinching. No, he said quietly, we don't. Something flickered in Samantha's face. Recognition, perhaps, that her last ally had abandoned her. The desperation curdled into rage, and she whirled back toward me with fury blazing in her eyes. You'll regret this, she hissed. I'll destroy you in court. I'll tell everyone what kind of senile, vindictive old man you really are. I'll make sure the whole town knows how you turned your own son against his wife. This isn't over, Henry. This is just the beginning. I met her gaze steadily, feeling the calm that comes when years of patient preparation finally bear fruit. Samantha, I want you to understand something. Every word you've said in this house for the past month has been recorded. Every threat, every plan, every lie. I paused, letting the words sink in. My wife made sure of it. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time since I'd met her, Samantha Whitmore Dawson had nothing to say. She looked around the room at the antique clock on the kitchen wall, at the smoke detector in the hallway, at every innocent object that might have concealed a watching eye, and I saw understanding dawn in her expression. She had been caught, completely, utterly, irrevocably. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic packing and barely contained hysteria. The Whitmores threw belongings into suitcases and garbage bags, their earlier arrogance replaced by desperate efficiency. The deputies supervised from doorways, ensuring no property was damaged and no confrontations escalated beyond angry words. Carol paused once to stare at me with pure hatred, but she said nothing. Even she understood that silence was now her only defense. Andrew and I retreated to the kitchen, away from the chaos. He filled the coffee maker while I found the mugs Linda had always used for special occasions, delicate china with painted flowers that hadn't seen daylight since her funeral. We stood at the counter together, father and son, sharing our first domestic moment in years. The simple act of preparing coffee felt like a ritual of reclamation, a quiet declaration that this was still our home. Through the window, I watched moving boxes pile up in the driveway. The Whitmores loaded their rented SUV with the debris of their failed conquest, their faces tight with humiliation. Samantha emerged last, carrying a designer bag and the tattered remains of her dignity. She looked back at the house, once at me, standing in the window, and I saw a promise of vengeance in her eye. But for the first time since Linda's death, I felt something other than grief or fear. I felt hope. The Whitmores were leaving, but Samantha wasn't finished fighting. She hired a lawyer and filed a countersuit, a desperate gamble that would force everything into open court. It was exactly what we were waiting for. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, the accumulated weight of countless judgments rendered within its walls. 3 weeks had passed since the eviction, 3 weeks during which Samantha had regrouped, hired an expensive attorney from the city, and launched her counterattack. She was suing me for wrongful eviction and intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming I had manufactured evidence and manipulated my own mentally declining mind to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. It was a bold strategy, born of desperation and funded by whatever remained of the Whitmore's resources. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation. The gallery was packed with local observers, drawn by whispered gossip about the Dawson family war. I recognized neighbors, former colleagues of Linda's, even the woman from the grocery store who always asked about my health. They had come to witness the spectacle, to see for themselves whether the quiet widower from Maple Street was truly the vindictive monster Samantha's lawyers had portrayed in their filings. I sat at the defendant's table beside Paul Hargrove, my hands folded calmly, my expression betraying nothing of the anticipation churning beneath my surface. Samantha sat across the aisle, flanked by her parents and a silver-haired attorney whose hourly rate probably exceeded my monthly pension. She wore a modest blue dress, clearly chosen to project innocence, her makeup subdued, her posture carefully calibrated to suggest vulnerability. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me since the proceedings began. Her attorney opened with a passionate narrative of family devotion corrupted by senile paranoia. He painted Samantha as a loving daughter-in-law who had sacrificed everything to care for an aging patriarch, only to be betrayed by a confused old man manipulated by outside forces. He referenced my age repeatedly, implied cognitive decline without stating it outright, and suggested that the evidence against his client had been fabricated by people with their own agendas. Then Paul Hargrove stood, and the temperature in the room shifted. He presented our evidence systematically, each piece building on the last like the components of a bridge designed to bear impossible weight. The hidden camera footage came first. 3 years of recordings showing Samantha's cruelty, her contempt, her careful manipulation. The courtroom watched in silence as she berated Linda during her illness, as Carol Whitmore outlined their strategy for acquiring the house, as Julia laughed about parking old men in wheelchairs. Samantha's attorney objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed the footage, his expression growing grimmer with each clip. The audio recordings followed the threats from the housewarming party, the family meeting demands, the casual discussions of forged documents and bribed physicians. Paul played Samantha's own voice, declaring her intentions. "We'll have you declared incompetent. We'll put you in the worst nursing home we can find, and then we'll sell this house and everything in it." The words echoed through the courtroom, stripped of context or excuse, damning in their naked cruelty. Expert witnesses testified about the forged documents. A handwriting analyst demonstrated the discrepancies between my genuine signature and the forgeries Samantha had created. A forensic accountant traced the $15,000 check Linda had discovered years ago, proving it had been deposited into an account Samantha controlled without authorization. Dr. Warren, Linda's former physician, took the stand and described Samantha's attempt to bribe him into providing fraudulent documentation of my cognitive decline. His testimony was devastating, his disgust barely concealed beneath professional composure. Finally, Paul presented my certified competency evaluation from Dr. Torres, establishing beyond any reasonable doubt that my mind was sharp, my judgment sound, and my decisions entirely my own. The narrative Samantha's attorney had constructed of a confused old man manipulated by shadowy forces collapsed under the weight of documented truth. But the moment that silenced the courtroom came when Paul called an unexpected witness. "Your Honor, the defense calls Grace Miller." Murmurs rippled through the gallery as Grace rose from her seat and walked steadily to the witness stand. She wore a simple gray dress, her silver hair pinned back, her expression carrying the calm dignity of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. Samantha's attorney objected to the surprise witness, but the judge overruled him, clearly invested in seeing where this testimony would lead. Paul approached the stand with measured steps. "Miss Miller, would you please state your relationship to the deceased Linda Dawson?" Grace took a breath, her eyes finding mine for just a moment before she spoke. "She was my sister, my younger sister. We were born Grace and Linda Patterson before we married and took different names." The courtroom erupted, Samantha's attorney shot to his feet, demanding explanations, objecting on grounds he seemed to be inventing on the spot. The judge gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Every observer in the room understood that Linda's protection of her husband had extended further than anyone had imagined. Grace continued her testimony over the noise. Linda asked me to protect her husband if anything ever happened to her. I've been documenting Mrs. Whitmore Dawson's behavior since my sister's funeral. Photographs, recordings, a journal of incidents, everything I witnessed from my home next door. She presented her evidence, corroborating what Paul had already established, and adding new details that painted an even more damning picture. By the time she stepped down from the stand, Samantha's case had been reduced to rubble. The judge's ruling came swiftly and severely. He dismissed Samantha's lawsuit with prejudice, ensuring she could never refile the same claims. He found her liable for elder abuse, fraud, and forgery, ordering restitution and legal fees totaling over $200,000. He issued a permanent restraining order barring her from any contact with me or my property. And in his final statement, he referred the forgery evidence to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. Samantha sat motionless as the judgment was read, her face a mask of disbelief. When the bailiff approached to escort her from the courtroom, Carol Whitmore let out a sob that echoed off the high ceilings. Mark stared straight ahead, his arrogance finally broken. They led their daughter away, and she never looked back, not at the judge, not at the gallery, not at Andrew, who sat on his father's side of the courtroom with tears streaming down his face. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But as the observers filed out and the courtroom emptied, I felt strangely hollow. The battle was won, but the cost had been measured in years of suffering I'd never known about, in a wife who'd fought alone to protect me. Then Paul touched my arm and handed me a red envelope. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "Linda left this too." The red envelope felt heavier than paper should. It was sealed with burgundy wax, an old-fashioned touch that was so perfectly Linda. She had always loved the rituals of an earlier era, the small ceremonies that elevated ordinary moments into something meaningful. I ran my thumb across the seal, feeling the impression of what might have been a flower pressed into the wax, and wondered how long this envelope had waited in Paul's office for this exact moment. "She gave me specific instructions," Paul said quietly. We were still in the courtroom, though everyone else had departed. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the empty benches. This was only to be opened after the legal matter was completely resolved. She was very clear about the timing. He paused, his professional composure softening into something more personal. "I've kept it in my safe for nearly 4 years, Henry. She made me promise. 4 years." Linda had prepared this final message while she was still healthy, while the cancer was nothing more than cells waiting to betray her. She had known even then that someday I might need not just protection, but a path forward. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. The wax cracked with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the empty room, releasing secrets held too long in darkness. Inside, I found another letter in Linda's elegant handwriting, and beneath it, a small bundle of documents held together with a faded ribbon. A set of keys slid into my palm, their metal cold and unfamiliar. I unfolded the letter and began to read, and with each word, the courtroom around me dissolved until nothing existed except Linda's voice speaking directly to my heart. "My dearest Henry," she had written, "if you're reading this, then the battle is over and you've won. I always knew you would, you just needed the right tools and the right moment. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of the man you've always been, even when you couldn't see your own strength." I had to stop, had to press my hand against my eyes and breathe through the grief that rose fresh and sharp despite everything. Paul stood silently nearby, giving me space, understanding that some moments require witness but not intrusion. "Now it's time to stop fighting and start living," the letter continued. "You've spent too long defending what we built. It's time to build something new. Remember our dream? The cabin by the lake where we said we'd grow old together, where we'd watch sunsets from the porch and listen to loons calling across the water. I never forgot that dream, Henry, and I never stopped planning for it." I turned to the documents bundled beneath the letter, my fingers clumsy as I untied the ribbon. Property records, a deed, a trust document dated 5 years ago, establishing ownership of real estate on Lake Champlain, the very lake where Linda and I had spent our honeymoon, where we'd returned for anniversaries and stolen weekends throughout our marriage, where we'd always said we would retire when the time was right. The cabin was real. Linda had purchased it in secret, using her own inheritance money she'd never touched, money I'd assumed was simply sitting in an account for emergencies. She'd bought our dream while she was still healthy, while there was still time to imagine a future. Knowing in some part of her heart that she might not live to see it, she'd given me a destination for the years she couldn't share. I returned to her letter, reading through tears that fell freely now. "The cabin has been waiting for you, my love. I furnished it myself during those weekends when I told you I was visiting old friends. I'm sorry for the small deception, but I wanted it to be perfect. There's a garden plot behind the kitchen where you can plant whatever you like. There's a dock where you can fish in the mornings. There's a porch swing facing west, positioned exactly right for watching the sun go down." She had thought of everything. Even in those final months, when her body was failing and her time was running out, she had been preparing not just my defense but my deliverance. "Sell the house on Maple Street," she wrote. "It holds too much pain now, too many memories shadowed by what happened at the end. Go to our lake, Henry. Plant new flowers. Make new memories. Let the water wash away the grief and the anger. And remember that we had 35 beautiful years together. That's what matters. That's what lasts." Her final words blurred as I read them, but I forced myself to see each letter, each curve of her handwriting that I knew as well as my own. "And know that wherever you are, I'm walking beside you. Every sunset, every morning, every quiet moment when you think you're alone, I'm there, my darling. I never left. I never will. I love you eternally. Your Linda." For a long time, I couldn't speak. I sat in the empty courtroom holding the keys to a future my wife had built for me, understanding at last the full measure of her love. She had protected me from predators, armed me for battle, guided me to victory, and then, when the fighting was done, she had given me a place to heal. Paul's hand rested briefly on my shoulder. "She was an extraordinary woman," he said softly. I nodded, unable to form words, clutching the keys like sacred objects. Linda had prepared everything, my protection, my victory, and my future. Now there was only one thing left to do: say goodbye to the past and walk into the new life she'd built for me. 3 months later, the for sale sign appeared on the front lawn of the house where Linda and I had built our life together. I stood at the window watching the real estate agent hammer it into the ground, each strike driving home the reality that this chapter was finally closing. The walls around me held 35 years of memories, first steps, birthday parties, quiet evenings, whispered conversations in the dark, but they also held shadows now, poisoned by what had happened within them. Linda had been right, as she always was. It was time to let go. The sign drew Samantha back one final time. I saw her car pull up to the curb on a gray Tuesday afternoon, watched her sit behind the wheel for several minutes before finally stepping out. She looked diminished somehow, smaller than the woman who had swept into my home with such confident entitlement. The designer clothes had been replaced by something simpler, her makeup minimal, her posture carrying none of its former arrogance. She walked up the path slowly, pausing at the porch steps where Linda used to tend her flower boxes. I met her there, standing in the doorway of a home that would soon belong to strangers. "I came to apologize," she said, though her eyes still held that calculating gleam I had learned to recognize. "Maybe we can work something out. For Andrew's sake, he shouldn't have to lose his childhood home because of mistakes I made." I studied her for a long moment, this woman who had tried to steal everything I loved, who had plotted and schemed and lied with such practiced ease. Perhaps she believed her own performance. Perhaps she had convinced herself that one final manipulation might salvage something from the wreckage. But I was no longer the confused old man she had tried to bury. "This home was Linda's heart," I said quietly. "Every room, every corner, every inch of it carried her love. You disrespected that love from the day you walked through the door. You disrespected her while she was dying, and you tried to destroy what she left behind." I shook my head slowly. "No one who treated her that way gets to stay. Not in the house, not in the memory, not in my forgiveness." Her mask slipped, just for an instant, revealing the fury beneath. But she had no weapons left, no leverage, no schemes that hadn't already crumbled to dust. "Goodbye, Samantha." I stepped back and closed the door. Through the window, I watched her stand motionless on the porch for nearly a minute before finally turning and walking away. She didn't look back. I never saw her again. The consequences of her choices cascaded through the following months. The district attorney pursued criminal charges for the forgery, and Samantha accepted a plea deal, 2 years probation, and a permanent felony record that would follow her forever. The affair became public during divorce proceedings, splashed across local gossip networks, and destroying whatever reputation she had left. Even her own parents distanced themselves once their role in the scheme was exposed. Carol faced her own investigation regarding what they had done to her mother's estate years ago, the pattern of exploitation finally catching up with the family that had made it a tradition. Last I heard, Samantha had moved across the country, starting over in a city where no one knew her name, carrying nothing but the wreckage of her ambitions. Andrew filed for divorce the week after the trial. Samantha, facing criminal charges and mounting legal fees, didn't contest anything, not the settlement, not the terms, not even the revelation about the pregnancy that wasn't his. The marriage dissolved quickly, like morning frost under a rising sun, leaving my son free for the first time in years. He helped me pack up the house, spending long weekends wrapping Linda's belongings in tissue paper and newspaper, carefully preserving the artifacts of a life well lived. We worked side by side for days, and somewhere between the boxes and the memories, we began to talk, really talk. He shared stories about his mother. I'd never heard small moments between them, conversations they'd had when I wasn't around. I told him about the early years of our marriage, the struggles and triumphs that had shaped who we became. The wounds that had festered for so long began, slowly, to heal. On our last day in the house, Andrew paused in the empty living room and looked at me with uncertainty in his eyes. "Dad, when you're settled at the cabin, would it be okay if I visited sometimes?" I didn't hesitate. "It's your home too, son. It always was. That's what family means." The cabin on Lake Champlain was everything Linda had promised and more. She had chosen it perfectly, a modest structure with weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch that faced west toward the water. The garden plot behind the kitchen waited for spring planting. The dock stretched out over gentle waves that lapped against the shore with peaceful rhythm. And the porch swing faced the sunset, positioned exactly as she had described. Grace, Aunt Grace, now, as I had learned to call her, moved to a cottage just down the road. She visited most evenings, bringing tea and company and stories about Linda's childhood that I treasured like precious gems. On this particular evening, we sat together watching the sun descend toward the mountains across the lake. The sky blazed orange and pink, colors reflecting off the water in ever-shifting patterns. Andrew's car was visible on the winding road below, bringing him for the weekend, and I could see another figure in the passenger seat, perhaps a new beginning of his own. On the table between Grace and me, Linda's photograph caught the golden light. She smiled at me from across the years, frozen in a moment of joy I remembered like yesterday. I raised my cup of tea in a silent toast. "We made it, my love," I whispered. "We finally made it." The lake stretched out before me, peaceful and infinite, and for the first time in years, I felt Linda's hand in mine again, not in grief, but in gratitude. She had given me protection, victory, and a future. But her greatest gift was reminding me that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to hold on. Every story leaves its mark, and this one about a husband's quiet strength, a wife's extraordinary love, and a family's journey through betrayal to redemption reminds us that the people who truly love us never stop protecting us, even when they're no longer here to hold our hands. Henry Dawson didn't win through anger or revenge. He won through patience, preparation, and the unwavering faith of a woman who knew him better than he knew himself. Linda saw the storm coming years before it arrived, and she built an ark strong enough to carry her husband safely through. That's what real love looks like, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but quiet sacrifices made in secret, protections put in place hoping they'll never be needed. For many of us watching, family isn't just about blood. It's about the choices we make, the people we stand beside, and the boundaries we set to protect what matters most. Henry's story asks us to consider our own lives, our own families, our own vulnerabilities. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age? Have you ever had to protect yourself from people who should have loved you? Have you ever discovered that someone was fighting for you all along, even when you didn't know it? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the one that helps someone else find the courage to stand their ground. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of family, justice, and the quiet power of those who refuse to be broken. And remember, sometimes the greatest strength isn't fighting back. It's knowing exactly when and how to let the truth speak for itself.